Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well and enjoying the data processing fundamentals with live Python code series. So far we have completed the 3 topics, and in this last topic we are going to build the UI or the application UI on top of the Python code we have completed so far. Through the coding, we have completed our Python application by writing both dataset selector and the dataset manager classes, and we are also consuming both classes in our application when a user selects a dataset library and a particular dataset from that library. The code which we have written for this application has been covered into various videos, and now in this particular video, we are going to take the existing Python code, and by adding the Gradio Python library, we will implement the UI. To build our UI, we just need to have a little more information about how we are going to add different UI component based on how our application works. The application starts by selecting a particular Python library which has various dataset or built-in dataset available for us. User selects a Python library and then select a dataset which belongs to given Python library. In the next step, user selects how many rows he or she wants from the given dataset and also decides that what method of row selection is used, either from top or the bottom or the random sampling. In another method, we also add the dataset filtering either by values or by categories. To build an UI, we just really need to create a system where we could select a dataset library which is supported by our application. We also need to either put a drop-down or create a text box where user can either type or select a dataset. Next, we can add a slider which can select how many rows we want. That will be the phase 1. And the next phase, we are going to add the filter support where anyone can select a filter method to either filter by value or the filter by category. And that is what exactly we are going to follow in our UI. So let's get ourselves coding. To develop the UI for our application, we are going to use the Gradio Python library, which is open source. And the source code for the Gradio you could find here. You can see that is very popular, having about 8.8 thousand stars. If you do not choose the Gradio, for example, your other alternatives are the Streamlit, which is another open source, very popular library. It is owned by Snowflake. As of now, the Streamlit is also open source. It's very popular, as you could see, about 20,000 stars it has. Similar to Streamlit, H2O.ai also has a Python library called the H2O Wave. It is also open and it's about 3,000 stars it has. And there are various H2O Wave apps are available which you could find here. So as you could see that you do have several options for you to build the UI application with Python. However, for this demo, we are going to choose the Gradio. If you are interested for Streamlit or H2O Wave, please do check out my YouTube channel and you will find a few videos related with both of them. To install Gradio, you can always look into the PyPy repo where the packages are always available. You can install Gradio by pip install Gradio. If you are using Conda, you can still use the pip there as well. So let's come back to our PyCharm. Here, I haven't installed the Gradio yet. I just wanted to install in front of you. So I will go look into the preferences. In the preference, you will find the Python interpreter. I'm using the Python 3.10, which is based on Conda. So I'm using the Anaconda to manage the Python virtualized environment for me with version 3.10 or 3.10. I do not have the Gradio installed, so I can install by clicking plus and search for Gradio. So because the Gradio is not available through the Conda environment, so the best option for me to install the Gradio is through the terminal. As you could see, this Py 310 shows that I am using the Conda environment. That's where it's coming from. I can use the pip install Gradio. The Gradio is installed here. You can always check the Gradio or any package by running the Python, and you can say import Gradio. If Gradio is installed in your Python runtime, it's always going to come back as a true result, means the package is imported. If you would want to check the version, you can always say as gr and then gr dot. So we are using the Gradio version 3.2, which we have just installed. Now in our code, if we would want to use the Gradio here, we can always check the import Gradio as gr. As you see that our import did not show any error. If you would want to just make sure everything is okay, you can always say here print Gradio version dot format gr dot version. You run the code. That will also validate that all of our code is working without any problem. And here is the Gradio version. It means Gradio is installed and ready to go. So before we start implementing the Gradio UI in this Python application, I wanted to just give you a very quick Gradio refresher. And for that, it's faster for us to use the Jupyter Notebook. So here I am at the Google Colab with a Jupyter Notebook open. The Google Colab does not have the Gradio installed by default. So first thing we need to install the Gradio. And if you have Google Gmail account, that's all you really need to get the Google Colab working. It's a free Python machine available for you for anything related with Python. I have a YouTube video which can show you how you could utilize the Gmail account you have to use the free Google Colab machine to experiment with Python. So we already have Gradio installed. I will go ahead and I will kill this cell we really do not need. So let's import the Gradio as gr. So let's take a look. So gr dot interface is the center of everything. So if you look into the gr dot interface, it's minimum required 3 arguments. First is a function, second is the inputs, and third is the outputs. It means what you would want to input, based on that you can run a function, and whatever the output coming out from this function will be rendered as the output. Input is your UI, output is how you would want to show your results. So first thing, I would create a function and I will call define Gradio UI handler. That's our function, and it will just return hello. That's it. And we will use Gradio UI handler as a first parameter. So we have completed the first requirement. As you see that now 2 arguments are missing. Second parameters, we will say that our input is label and the output is also label. Let's run it. Now you see that this is the interface design for our Gradio application. However, the application is not running. You can run application 2 ways. You can say dot launch and your application will run, and very quickly you could see that there is a input design which takes a label, there is an output design which generates the output, and if you submit, because we are not giving any input, so that's why it shows us error, but at least you can get an idea that this is how the Gradio interface is launched. Other option for you to launch Gradio is to just call it my app, or you can create any variable here and then you can define everything here. Then you can say my app dot launch and everything is here. So that's how you could launch it. We will just keep this inside here, and that is what we have. If we would want to change our input or output, that's where we need to start adding more code to it. Let me make a little bigger. Now you can also use the input as a text. Let's run it. You could see that there is a text box input is created and label is the output. If you run it, error because we didn't put anything, but we can say Python, there is no, because we are not passing anything. Now what you could do is that you can actually take a parameter to pass from here. We could pass a parameter as the value and we can print that value. Let's run it. Here we haven't really interfaced anything with this function. Output is label, but there is no value. But if we call here is Python, you see Python is written. So even we haven't created a wiring between input and output, this function automatically understands that, oh, what you would want to do. Anything will be input here will be returned as an output if not too much is given. If you would want to add something here, you can actually add more to it. So you could actually say here dot format value. It's a pure Python code. Reason I choose this interface because it's easier for us to write the code and see it. So I would say Python, the output is Python. That's your label. If you change this from label to text, means your input is text and your output is text. Let's run it. Now, if you put submit, the output is, if you see, that's all printed because there is nothing being input. If I would say input is today, output is today. So you can get an idea that how very soon we can create a UI which can take one or more inputs and can also do the output. Now we need to collect two inputs from here and in the function handler, sum it first and then print the total as output. There is value 1, there is value 2, and the output will be these two values plus 1. Now we need to be little more creative. We need two text boxes. If we want to add two text boxes, we could actually use an array here, and first text, we got input 2 text, automatically there should be value 1, value 2, and output will be text also. Let's run it. And as you could see here, system automatically understands that, oh, you need two inputs. Let me give you 5, let me give you 7, submit 5, 7, because these two values are processed as a string here. If you would want to convert them to int of first value, then int of second value. Let's run it. 5, 7, output is 12. There are so many input methods you could define looking into the documentation. These are the UI components you could have added into the UI. If you would want to add the text box similar to that, there is a code we could have written. Let's see what we could have done. We could have actually changed this and just written here gr.textbox. The first label is lines. We just need one line. You can actually have the 5 line, 10 lines too, depending on. Similar to that, we could actually have run it. Now we have added 2 lines. Our UI text box is little formatted. Enter number, enter another number. Now we could give a number. This way it is. Now let's come back and build a very simple data frame render application so that we could develop our UI. So I will be adding import. We need these libraries. We will decide that our output is data frame. So they have a type called data frame output. Here we will create another function where we will read the data frame. So we can say df is equal to sns.load dataset, and we will call it diamonds. So now we have a data frame. We can actually also say df, and it's just going to print the 10 rows. So we are reading a data set named diamonds, just keeping the 10 random rows, and then that's we are printing. So now we know that df is our variable which has these rows. So rather than this line, we will return the df. Very simple. This method will be called, but it will return the df as a data frame, and data frame is type is output, not the text. Now as you could see here, because our output type is data frame, there is an empty data frame is already added here. Right now if we submit is the data frame, first n rows related with diamonds is listed here. These are all the columns, and here is the code. We just decided that our output is data frame type, and that's the reason this method is returning the data frame. Now if you would want to select which data frame you want, you can actually change this code. What we could say, we can actually pass very first here the text box. We can say enter the dataset name. That will be dataset name. First one is the ds name, and this method is going to convert this whole thing to define read dataset ds name if ds name in, either you can ask for diamonds, You can also ask for planets. You can also ask for Titanic. If any of these condition, the data set name will be that particular choice and return will be data frame. And if there is an error, if this condition is not, then we can return an empty data frame. Return pandas dot data frame, and we just call it status. Value will be error bad data set name. So I have created a very simple empty data frame with one row and one column. Label is status, value is this. That's our method is called. This method read data set is going to be called here, and we will pass this ds name, and this method is going to be hold this df variable. There you go. Let's run it. So we have ran both code. This is read data set, which reads the data set. So we will call the data set name is, this time we will call it Titanic. Titanic, submit. Here you see Titanic data set visible. If we call it something bad, hello, you will see that error is there. So let's look into our code very quickly. Data set is not in diamonds. That's why it's returning the data frame. Data frame, oh, this should be data frame uppercase. So data frame, and let's run it. If our data frame is planets, here is the planet data set. If we call anything else none, run, you will get an empty data frame as defined here. Status bad data set name. Next, we will take this whole code and we will come back to our PyCharm and write the Gradio code over there. In this Python application, we will add method, this here, import SNS for now, because we already have full code working. Import Seaborn as SNS. So we are importing Seaborn as SNS, and then pandas, just to make sure our code works first. Then we will connect everything back to our old code. Next, this method. We do not need this line. Let's take this whole launcher code, add it here. So here is our launcher code. Here is we are launching, and this whole code which we were writing earlier, we will take this whole code and convert this to old new function. Define previous dataset code. So we kept our previous code, and now the main is actually using the Gradio as the launcher. We will comment these two. So everything inside main is our the Gradio UI launcher. Let's run this code. As you could see that the code, when we run, it's available at localhost or the 127.0.0.1, and also a particular port is which is 7860. So here is the UI. We can set the dataset name Titanic. Here is our Titanic dataset. So we can work side by side code and UI together. If we stop our code runtime, as you see here, the UI is no longer working. Now, if we look into Titanic, you see here that we are reading 10 rows by default. Next, rather than by default of 10, we can actually use a size as a slider here, and that slider will set how many rows we want. So let's add the slider. So in the UI, where we are adding these two lines, we can actually add gr.slider label dataset, and after the label, we need to provide what is the min, max, and the default value. So we can say min is a 1 record, max we can use 1000 record, and minimum we will bring only 5 records. So 1 is our minimum. So let's use here. Minimum is 1, maximum is 1000. Current value should be 5. And if you would want to change the steps, so for example, for every mouse movement, you will add 5 more. So you can actually say steps are 5. And that is your slider. So we have removed the text and instead we are using the slider. And the second value we need to add here. So this will be row count is our second value. The value whatever is going to be set here will be added into the row count. We need to pass this row count to this method where the read data set is, and row count is going to come here, and at that time it is going to use the row count here. We rerun this code. Let's reload, and as you could see that the text box is here and the slider here. So we could say we need diamonds data set, but we need only 40 rows. Okay, let's run it. There are 40 rows available related with this data set. If we select this to 11, now we have 11 rows. If we change this to planets, these are the planet values. So now you can get an idea that how we are adding more and more code and we are adding UI to our method. However, we have already written all the code in this application. So we should start using our original code here, because we do not need to write any new code here. So we will keep this Gradio UI handler. However, rest we have to figure it out how this code is going to take care of our work. So very first, if you look into here, we start from our code. We need the dataset name and we also need the dataset library. Let's take this code, bring that code here. So we have the dataset name. We can use this. That's the dataset name. Return df. We are getting the dataset. Dataset name is ds name. Row count is going to be applied little later. We do not need this. Now the only issue we have is that dataset selector. By default, we are using the SNS already because these three datasets are part of Seaborn Python library. Let's rerun this code, reload. At this point, we are using our existing method or existing code to start implementing here. I will use the Titanic because it has about 800 rows. Titanic. Here is the Titanic dataset. If you would want to use the planets, we can also use the planets here. Planets are there. Now, it would be really good if we could also add support for our other library, which is the Scikit-learn we had, because we could support that library too. It means we only need to add one more UI to select the library. We can add this dropdown, Gradio dropdown. In this dropdown, we can also have the label play select dataset library, and the values will be Seaborn, and we are also using the Scikit-learn. These are the values. The default value we can select Seaborn. Now we need to add the very first variable as a dataset library. So we call it ds library. We need to pass that also here and make sure that this method also supports the library. So every time when you are going to add new UI components here, this Gradio UI handler also has to be updated for each UI component so you can manage the returns. And please keep in mind that as we are adding more and more UI components, we are also handling them. Because remember, the dataset selector has the library, can be named as a Seaborn, Scikit-learn, sklearn, SNS. We can provide any of these names. They're all going to work. Only difference is that they all has to be lower cases. So in the read dataset, when these variables are being passed, we can just call it the ds library dot lower. So it's gonna be lowercase value. Now let's rerun the code, reload it. So the code is running, but our dropdown is not working. We can look into the documentation, search for dropdown choices. Oh, it should be choices. That should be enough for us to fix the problem and run the code. Let's relaunch. Okay, you see that our choices are Seaborn and Scikit-learn, and Seaborn was the default. Let's choose the Seaborn and call it Titanic. We have Titanic data, survived, P class, sex, that's very good. Let's choose the Scikit-learn and use the iris. Let's see where is the very good. You see here that when we are checking, we should not check here. At this point, we just really need to pass the DS library here, and we should not check any of this. We should read this. At this point, we just check if df.empty, if df.empty, which is not, that's it. We are taking the library, passing it, taking the data set, passing it, and it's going to select the data set and it's going to pass it to us. Let's run it. Reload. 7861. The IP address is same, but the port has been changed. 7861 must be 7861. So let's use the Scikit-learn iris. Here is the iris data set. Let's use the Seaborn. Call it planets. Here is your planets data set. Your row is not implemented here because we haven't handled the row count, which is coming little later. As our code, we are handling rows in the different level. So we have completed this code. Now we need to run the records limit and the limit type. So remember, the limit type we are handling three different ways: sample, top, and bottom. It means we have to add one more option here so that we could choose which method you would want these number of rows. So let's add that code together as well. So just before the slider, we can add gr.radio, and I will just show you how you could very quickly figure it out how to add the new UI component. You look for radio. So if we add the gr.radio, the label equals, please select the row, sampling type, and your values will be, these are the choices. So we need to select the choices, and our choices will be top, bottom, and sample, and the default value will be, let's use as a top, comma, and this is the third option here. So here we will call it row limit type. Let's pass the row limit type here, dot lower, and that is where the third parameter is passed here, and we can look into same code here. Now let's use the DS manager. So DS records limit type is this, records limit is this variable, the df is correct, DS manager dot data frame is your return data frame, because that is what we are using to print here. So DS manager dot data frame if you would want to print its value. Let's run this code. 7860. We are picking the Seaborn diamonds dataset from top 5 record. These are the 5 records. Let's use the bottom, different. Let's use the sample, random, all different. So you can get an idea that how quickly we are keep adding more and more UI component. We can select whatever particular dataset we are interested into, iris. Now remember, even if we are taking sample and we are taking 986 record, but it's not going to generate an error because sample size is bigger than the dataset size. So it's automatically returning only one sample as we have written the code earlier. So our code is being integrated as we have expected. The code related to this exercise is available at this DeepWorks GitHub repo in the developer program location. You can get this particular exercise code in this folder code part 4a and in this Python classify Python application. So we will stop this session here. We have completed our Gradio based UI and we can render those result set either from top or the bottom or the random sampling methods. In the next video, we are going to add both filtering through values as well as the filtering through categorical items in our dataset. And we will also learn how to modify the UI and add some style sheets as well as the new layout to make our application looks more impressive and has lot more user experience built into specific to our application. Thanks for your time and I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next video.